Good morning, YouTube. Welcome to the Reptile Barn. So I have thought for a very long time, and I've addressed it a little bit, but I want to do a whole video about this. Can any reptile or exotic pet ever challenge the ball python? And full disclaimer, I don't know a ton about like the aquatic fish. Well, fish are all aquatic, obviously, but like aquatic pets. And I don't know a ton about like birds, people who keep parrots. And so I don't know, maybe something in there challenges, the ball python for popularity. But I'm going to be talking about reptiles, amphibians, pretty much exclusively. Maybe a little bit of like invertebrates. Okay? So, while a lot of people in the reptile hobby will look at Morph Market and they'll be like, oh my gosh, there's like as many ball pythons as everything else put together. On Morph Market, that's true. I don't think that's quite how they're actually represented, though, in the reptile keeping community. I think Morph Market is specifically very, very suited for ball pythons, right? I just think that it's a place where almost all ball python sellers will go. And a lot of buyers also. I'm not certain that that's representative of the actual numbers, okay? Also, I apologize. My little tripod is dying, so the camera keeps slipping. But anyways, I do think it's fair to say, though, the ball pythons are the most popular pet reptile. So I want to talk about what makes them so popular, but not really a video about ball pythons, but rather, are there other reptiles out there I think someday might kind of reach that same level? Okay, I like to break things up into tiers. So I've written down some numbers here. I've got 4 tiers of reptile popularity, I guess you could call it. Okay, and I want to talk about how and when a species or even a group of species that are similar to each other might move up or down those tiers of popularity. Okay? And then we'll see at the end if I think anything could ever challenge the ball python. My last tier, my 4th tier, so that's the lowest, right? Animals that are very, very, very rarely kept in captivity for one of 2 reasons. Either they are just very not well known. That's probably a better way of wording that. But even reptile enthusiasts often don't know what these are. I'm thinking of things like, stiletto snakes, or maybe even like large crocodilians that aren't unknown, but there's just very, very few people that can keep them. So even if people wanted to, you can't have a saltwater crocodile in your rack system, right? So those are the 2 types of animals that I think will probably always be what I would call tier 4. Very few, but dedicated, highly dedicated keepers, right? That are into the obscure, lesser known groups of reptiles, the spectacled lizards. There's a bunch of types of reptiles out there that are just virtually never seen in the hobby. Now, while I don't think something that's gigantic and dangerous like a large crocodilian is ever going to get out of tier 4, some of the obscure species theoretically could, right? So that's happened before, right? Like, look at the crested gecko. They're by my definition tier 1. So it can happen, but a lot of times it's not going to, right? So I don't even have numbers on how many people keep those types of animals because it's very, very few. Like less than 100 private keepers possibly in the entire world keeping animals like that. So I'm not counting, zoos and sanctuaries and things. Tier 3, I have written down like the armadillo girdled lizard. Okay, um, that's a species that is iconic. A lot of reptile keepers know it and kind of want it. They covet it, right? But they don't have it for whatever reason. They are very hard to get because they're very slow breeders in this case. Now, there's a bunch of reasons an animal could be tier 3. Um, but typically, there's going to be more keepers of them total than these tier 4 animals. But for whatever reason, they're just still super rare, and they typically are going to be very expensive. Now, not always. I also wrote down there's a guy named Steve Bull who does garter snakes. And you would never think, oh, garter snakes are those super, super rare things. Well, he keeps, I would guess, dozens of species of garter snake. He's just a specialist, and his collection is incredible. Just a really professional, immaculate, put together collection of garter snakes. Some of them that are really well known species, others that are really not. And I don't believe there's ever going to be a gigantic market for some of these rare Mexican varieties of garter snakes, for example, that he keeps. They're tier 3. Now, they're not, I don't think, particularly difficult to get necessarily. There's just not high demand, right? But the demand that there is are going to be people that are really enthusiasts for that genus, right? I'm so sorry about my camera constantly tilting like this. I don't know if it's going to work out or not. I might just have to pick it up and hold it. So that's tier 3. Now, before I move on to tier 2, I'd like to point out that, in my opinion, and something I had been super excited about, tree monitors had been making their way from a tier 3 animal up to a tier 2 animal. Their popularity was rising rapidly. The proliferation of captive breeding, so really healthy, well socialized, parasite free, ethically sourced tree monitors, was skyrocketing. Still kind of is, but they were making that jump from a tier 3 to a tier 2 because they're really awesome looking, they're popular, they're not huge, they're expensive, but not, you're not going and dropping $20,000 for a tree monitor. I'm sorry, I'm just going to pick this up because this is ridiculous. Ugh, let go. So, sorry about that. I just was very excited to see this progress, right, for tree monitors, and hopefully it will still occur, but the recent listing of blue tree monitors as endangered has put a dampening on things, right, that I hope gets downgraded or reversed, but I have a whole nother video on that. Regardless, tier 2 animals are typically very sought after, at least by a decent section of the reptile community, right? A lot of people know about them. A lot of people want them. The price is often, but not always, what is keeping them from being a tier 1 animal. That, and sometimes, the difficulty of keeping them. I don't mean difficulty necessarily like there's something where the technical skill of keeping is in question, but more like maybe they need a large space, like all the varanids do. Even tree monitors, some of the smallest varanids there are, need a lot of space. Maybe it's difficult to find captive bred. Maybe it's a species that has been hybridized a lot and you're trying to find a pure variety and it's hard to find. So whatever the reason may be, they're not tier 1. They're not just like in every pet store, and people who've never heard of Morph Market are keeping them. Not that Morph Market is the end all be all, but it's just, a lot of people in the reptile community know about Morph Market. But there's plenty of people who keep tier 1 animals that they still think of like Petco when they're like, I got to go get a reptile, right? So let's move into tier 1. And then I'm going to go back to tier 2 and talk about some of the animals in it that I think maybe could make the jump, right? Now, I'll be honest up front. Tier 1 could be split into two. You could have ball pythons as their very own tier, and then all the rest of these that I'm going to list to you. Now, remember, these are only morph market numbers, and only morph market for the US and Canada numbers, okay? So, huge grain of salt. Because I do not believe that this is representative of the entire reptile keeping community, okay? I think that Morph Market favors ball pythons heavily just by virtue of how the website works and how the ball python industry works in a few ways that aren't typical of the rest of the reptile world, okay? But let me read you some numbers. I just was looking up on Morph Market. Morph Market currently has about 2,300 leopard geckos listed, a little over 500 bearded dragons, 2,000 corn snakes, over 4,000 boas. That's predominantly BCIs, and then over 7,000 crested geckos. So that's a lot. There are over 38,000 ball pythons on Morph Market right now, just for the US and Canada region. Okay, so those are the numbers. Well, I have been racking my brains trying to figure out why those species, because those are substantially different species from each other. The care requirements, the breeding, the type of caging, what they eat, their temperature needs, from a ball python to a bearded dragon to a crested gecko, a BCI. These are very, very different things, right? So why those? Why those species are so popular, and others that I might say, oh, well, this is fairly similar to this, but they just don't have the same amount of demand or supply or both. And I was really tempted to say that the unifying feature of these animals is that it's easy to produce a lot of them for cheap, and they are extremely non-threatening species. However, it's not entirely true. Compared to your typical reptile, I don't know that a bearded dragon, for example, is ridiculously less expensive or time consuming to take care of than many of these other species that aren't as popular. Many of the ball pythons being sold are very expensive. And even the non-threatening feature, a BCI gets big. A good feed bite from a large boa is a fairly serious bite. Not life-threatening, of course, but I wouldn't want to get bit by a big 40-pound boa, right? Or even bigger. So while I do think that those things I listed are important, you know, the price, the accessibility, being able to breed them easily, that is a feature of all of those species. I'm just not sure why. I don't know. I don't know. One thing about those particular species is that with a moderate to minimum amount of work, all of those species, I know for a fact, can be quite well socialized. Now, so can a huge array of other species, but maybe it's a conglomeration of all of these features. Maybe these just hit every check. They check every box, right? They are accessible. They're trainable, not trainable like teaching them tricks, but just they become used to their people very quickly. They're very unlikely to be aggressive if you've housed them and cared for them and socialized them properly. I I don't know. The last thing I was thinking about for the tier 1 animals is that they're very, very marketable. Um, I believe every species I listed, ball pythons, corn snakes, bearded dragons, cresties, leopard geckos, and boas, all of those have morphs. Okay? In fact, all of those have a lot of morphs. That is something that appeals to people. We like variety. We're just wired to appreciate variety. So when you can have a species that within that species has a huge amount of variety, that is appealing and it draws people in. And because they got popular mostly before the social media age, social media has helped those to take off massively. A lot of people who aren't into reptiles at first find them through social media. Somebody pops up on their YouTube or whatever and they get interested, and then pretty soon they want one of these things. Now, I want to talk real briefly, because I don't want this to be a half-hour video, but I want to talk about a few tier 2 species that I think could make the jump to tier 1, and then I want to see if any of these, in my opinion, could make the jump all the way up to more of a tier 1A, like the ball pythons, right? Where they're just absolutely everywhere. So, let me go over a couple of species here real quick. Tarantulas and jumping spiders. Especially tarantulas, I think. Very popular pets. They aren't super expensive, at least the more common species. They don't take a huge amount of space. They're not expensive to feed. They got a lot of things going for them, right? So I think those have the potential to make another big jump all the way up to what I would call tier 1. Maybe some of the various king snakes, and maybe some of them already are, by the way. I don't have a ton of data here for you. You might hear some of these and be like, I think those are just as popular as these. You might be right. Gray banded king snakes, very popular. Mexican black king snakes, very popular. So maybe something in the king snake family. Axolotls are very popular. Then here's my two that I think either already have or are soon going to break into tier 1. Okay, here's kind of the climax of the video. Superdwarf retics and house snakes. I think they're the African house snakes. They are, in my opinion, poised to just dominate in coming years. I think so many people are going to keep Superdwarf retics and house snakes. For many of the same reasons we've already talked about. They are getting easier to breed. They're more and more accessible, which means that for some of them, the prices are already very reasonable. They aren't super dangerous. You know, they're not really scary. They aren't crazy expensive as far as like their space requirements or their feeding requirements. They're very morphable, right? Now I realize with the dwarf retics, you have to use mainland blood to get those morphs in there, but then dedicated breeders are able to breed back into pure dwarf and super dwarf lines to bring the size back down over the next couple generations. I just think that they've kind of hit all of the various things that I think make for a super popular reptile. They can be so sweet and well-tempered. Yeah, so those are the ones that I think could definitely break their way into tier 1. Will any of them challenge the ball python? No. I don't think so. I don't think that's because they're not as good as ball pythons. Now, I love ball pythons. I've spent a huge amount of my YouTube life defending ball pythons, but I don't think they're better than other snakes. I love them, but I don't think it's because of some intrinsic value that ball pythons are going to dominate forever. But I do think the ball pythons are going to dominate forever. I really do. It's been predicted every couple of years for decades that the ball python market is going to crash, and it just doesn't crash. It slows down. It follows economic trends, of course, but they have been resilient, and people love them too much for them to totally crash out. I think this will be the most popular pet reptile forever. I just don't think anything else will ever reach this tier. If that makes you angry hearing that, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to upset anybody. I know that there is a contingent of reptile people who really hate, maybe not necessarily the ball pythons themselves, although there's some of that, but also the really advanced market and the sheer number of breeders and production. There's a lot of anger about that. However justified that may or may not be, it's not going away. I just don't see it ever. I think ball pythons will be around as the top dog of reptile breeding and pet reptile popularity forever. I don't understand how you could look at this incredible animal right here, this beautiful guy who won't stop moving, and not think he's awesome. But that's it. That is my tier list. That is what I think has potential to move up. I hope that tree monitors don't move back down, but we'll see. And that was it. I'm sorry for the weird, like, looking at me from underneath because I had to pick up my phone. I need a new tripod. But let me know your thoughts, and if any of you have other species that I did not name that you think are on the up and up, or other reasons that I didn't name for animals being in these different tiers, I would love to hear them in the comments. And other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, we're the Reptile Barn.